The blinding lights of the police car flashed in bursts of red and blue across the dark street. Officer Rick Patterson stepped out, his hand gripping his flashlight tightly as he approached the black SUV parked by the curb. Inside, the driver, a tall black man in his late 40s, sat with a calm, unwavering gaze. "Step out of the vehicle." Patterson's voice was loud and brash. He pulled this man over for a supposed traffic violation, but his tone made it sound like something far worse. The driver lifted his hand slightly, his expression unreadable as he opened the door and stepped out. He was calm, far too calm, for Patterson, a twinge of suspicion warming into his mind. "Hands behind your back," Patterson commanded, reaching for his cuffs without another word. The man obliged, staying silent as the cold metal locked around his wrists. Passers-by stopped to watch the scene unfold, some even pulling out their phones. Patterson ignored them. To him, this was just another routine arrest, or so he thought. As he pushed the man against the car, Patterson suddenly noticed the glint of medals and insignia on the man's uniform. At first, he thought it was some kind of prank, but the badges were unmistakable, and in that instant, his face went pale. This man wasn't just anybody. What's your name?" Patterson's voice, once loud and commanding, faltered. The man turned his head, meeting Patterson's gaze with a calm authority that made the officer's heart skip a beat. "I am Admiral James Carter of the United States Navy." The officer's hands shook slightly, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the mistake he'd just made, but the Admiral's calm gaze held steady. He hadn't protested, hadn't shouted or resisted. He had just let Patterson proceed, almost as if he were waiting for this moment. The crowd around them murmured, their curiosity piqued as they leaned in to hear more. What would happen next? Earlier that day, the streets had been bustling with activity. Admiral James Carter was returning from an official meeting, his mind still fixed on matters of national importance. Despite his high rank and countless achievements, he preferred to drive himself when he could, enjoying the small moments of peace that the open road provided. But the peace didn't last long. Patterson had been watching the SUV from the moment it appeared on the street. He'd spotted it earlier near a busy intersection, and, convinced it was suspicious, decided to follow. At first, there was no reason for alarm. The SUV was moving at a safe speed, obeying every traffic rule. But Patterson's mind raced, finding reasons to justify his decision. As he tailed the SUV, Patterson ran through every protocol he'd ever been taught. He was convinced that he was about to stop a criminal. The driver's calm demeanor only added to his suspicion, fueling his belief that something was being hidden. Finally, he saw what he needed. The SUV's left turn signal had blinked a second too late before a lane change. It was minor, something most officers would let slide, but Patterson didn't hesitate. Flashing his lights, he signaled for the SUV to pull over. James noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, his first reaction one of mild surprise. He'd been driving carefully, as always, and couldn't imagine what had attracted the officer's attention. Nevertheless, he pulled over without protest, his mind already shifting to possible reasons for the stop. The moment Patterson approached the window, James sensed the officer's hostility. Patterson's stare was intense, his questions direct and accusatory. Still, James kept his voice even, answering calmly and without hesitation. When Patterson ordered him out of the car, James took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for something he wasn't. It wasn't the first time he felt the weight of suspicion just because of his skin color. But it was the first time an officer had acted with such aggression without cause. James followed every instruction, fearing the eyes of onlookers as he stepped out of the SUV. His calm was both a defense and a test. Would this officer see reason before it was too late? Would he recognize the uniform, the insignia, and realize his error? Patterson, however, saw none of it. His mind was too focused on completing the arrest, on proving himself right. But just as he was about to push James into the back of the squad car, he noticed the glint of medals on his uniform. Patterson's heart sank as he stared at the medals, his eyes darting over the badges on James's uniform. Each one represented years of service, of dedication and courage, things that Patterson couldn't even begin to understand. The moment of realization hit him like a wave, and he stepped back, his face pale as he tried to process what was happening. He hadn't just pulled over a civilian. He'd arrested a U.S. Naval Admiral. James watched the officer's reaction, the surprise and fear spreading across his face. He could have spoken up earlier, could have used his authority to demand respect. But he decided to remain silent, knowing that the truth would reveal itself. It always did. People in the crowd were whispering, their eyes glued to the scene. They'd heard what he'd said. An admiral? Someone murmured. Did he just say he's an admiral? Yes, that's exactly what I said, James answered calmly, his voice low but carrying a quiet strength. I serve this country, and I'm here to serve and protect just as much as you are, Officer Patterson. Patterson felt a tremor in his hand as he instinctively moved it away from his weapon, realizing how serious his mistake had been. For a few moments he said nothing, unable to find the words to explain himself. Finally he stammered, I didn't realize, sir. I didn't know. I thought. You thought what? James interrupted, his tone still calm, but there was a sharp edge in his words now. That I was a threat because of the color of my skin. Patterson froze, his eyes darting from James's face to the crowd around them. People were recording, and he knew his every word was being captured. The whole situation was unraveling fast, and he could feel his career slipping through his fingers. I apologize, sir, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. It was a mistake. A mistake. James' tone grew firmer. Do you think my life is just a mistake to be shrugged off? The silence that followed was heavy, and Patterson swallowed, searching for a way out. But James didn't stop there. Take these cuffs off, he said quietly, his voice steady but commanding. Patterson's hands shook as he reached for the keys, fumbling as he unlocked the cuffs. When the metal finally clicked open, James rubbed his wrists, glancing at the officer, who looked as if he wanted to vanish into thin air. But before he could say anything, the silence was shattered by a sharp voice from the crowd. Why'd you do it, officer? What's your excuse this time? The question hung in the air, and Patterson turned to see the faces of onlookers staring at him with disdain. He tried to gather his thoughts, but no explanation would come. There was no way to justify what he'd done, not to himself, not to anyone watching. James looked at him for a long, tense moment, then turned to address the crowd, his voice filled with an authority that cut through the tension. We all make mistakes, but this isn't the first time, is it? He didn't look at Patterson as he spoke, but seemed to address everyone around them. We know the story too well. I'm here in uniform, serving this country, and still, here we are. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Patterson felt his face flush with shame. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. He'd been trained to protect, to serve, but here he was, the subject of anger and disappointment from people he'd sworn to keep safe. But James' gaze softened, and he continued, his voice quiet. But even though I wear this uniform, I know that I'm treated differently, that many of us are. And it shouldn't take being an admiral for me to be treated with respect. Patterson was about to speak, but before he could, James turned back to him. I could file a report, officer. I could see to it that you face consequences for what you've done here today. But maybe, just maybe, you need to face yourself first. With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, leaving Patterson standing there, speechless. The crowd watched as James drove away, his quiet dignity leaving a lasting impact on everyone who had witnessed the scene. But just as the car pulled away, Patterson's radio crackled, and a voice came through, tense and urgent. There was a hostage situation downtown, and officers were needed immediately. Patterson didn't hesitate. He jumped into his squad car, his mind still reeling from what had just happened, but knowing he couldn't afford to falter now. As he raced toward the scene, his thoughts kept drifting back to Admiral James Carter, to the quiet power in his words. The hostage situation was intense. Patterson sped through the streets, sirens wailing as he wove through traffic. He arrived to see several other police cars already there, officers crouched behind their vehicles, weapons drawn. The building, a small bank in the center of town, had its windows covered, and only shadows could be seen moving inside. As Patterson stepped out of his car, his mind still weighed down by the earlier encounter, Sergeant Davis approached, her face tense. Glad you're here, Patterson, she said, her voice low but urgent. We got about 10 hostages inside. We're dealing with 2 armed suspects, possibly more. SWAT's on their way, but we need to keep this under control until they arrive. Patterson nodded, his mind sharpening. This was what he trained for. He could handle this. Whatever mistakes he'd made earlier, he told himself he could still be useful here. He positioned himself among the other officers, waiting for instructions, feeling the weight of the responsibility in every moment that ticked by. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the police radio. It was one of the suspects. We want a negotiator, the voice demanded, low and threatening. No funny business, or we start shooting. Patterson looked around. There wasn't a negotiator on site yet. The situation had unfolded too quickly. Patterson glanced at Davis, who gave a quick nod. Just keep them talking. Buy us time, she said. He took a deep breath and reached for his radio, steadying his voice. "This is Officer Patterson. I get to talk. Let's keep things calm and work this out." A tense silence followed, then a response. "Fine, but I'm only giving you 5 minutes to get me what I need. I want a car and a clear way out. If I don't get it, I'll start with the hostages." Patterson felt his pulse quicken. 5 minutes was barely enough time to strategize, much less get them what they wanted. "Listen," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "We can work something out, but we need to know everyone's safe in there. Can you confirm that?" Another silence followed, and Patterson held his breath. He glanced at Davis, who mouthed, "Keep them on the line." "Everyone's safe, for now," the voice replied. "But our patience is running thin, officer." Just as Patterson was about to respond, another car pulled up. Patterson squinted, and his stomach flipped when he saw who stepped out. Admiral James Carter, in full uniform, walking toward the police barricade with a calm, resolute expression. He'd seen the commotion on his way home and stopped to help, drawn by a sense of duty he couldn't ignore. Davis looked startled but nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. We're handling it the best we can." Carter's gaze shifted to Patterson, who was still holding the radio, a look of uncertainty on his face. "Officer Patterson," Carter said, his voice even. "I heard you're leading the negotiation. May I?" Patterson hesitated. He felt a mix of embarrassment and relief. Part of him wanted to prove himself, but another part of him knew that Carter's experience could make all the difference. He nodded and handed over the radio. "Yes, sir." Carter took the radio, his expression unreadable. He brought it to his lips and spoke in a calm, controlled tone. "This is Admiral James Carter of the United States Navy. I'm here to talk, and I'm here to make sure everyone comes out safely. Let's start by ensuring everyone inside is unharmed." There was a pause, and then the voice responded, this time with a slight edge of uncertainty. "An admiral? What's an admiral doing here?" "That doesn't matter," Carter replied smoothly. "What matters is that I'm here, and I have the authority to negotiate with you. Now, if you're willing to work with us, we can make sure this ends peacefully." The line was silent again, but the tension in the air had shifted. The suspects inside were thrown off guard, the sudden introduction of someone with Carter's rank disrupting whatever power they thought they held. Patterson watched, his mind still racing. Here was Carter, the same man he cuffed just an hour earlier, stepping in to handle a crisis without hesitation, his calm demeanor cutting through the tension. He felt a strange mix of shame and admiration as he watched the Admiral in action. "All right, Admiral," the voice finally replied, "but we still want a car, and we want a way out. You get us that, and we'll let everyone go." Carter didn't flinch. "We can discuss that, but first, I need to know who I'm speaking with. What's your name?" "My name's not important," the voice snapped. "Just get us the car." Carter paused, then continued, his voice steady. "Fine, let's talk about the car, but know that we'll need some time to arrange that. We'll start by getting food and water for the hostages. How does that sound?" The voice on the other end hesitated, and Carter seized the opportunity. "No one wants this to turn violent. Let's work together to get everyone out safely." Patterson watched, impressed despite himself. Carter's calm and patience were remarkable. He knew how to read people, how to shift the balance of power without making threats. The Admiral was giving them time for the SWAT team to arrive, time to coordinate a plan. It was masterful. But just as it seemed the situation was starting to calm, a sudden gunshot rang out from inside the building. The crowd gasped, and Patterson's heart skipped a beat. The radio went silent, the voice on the other end vanishing as tension spiked. Carter's expression tightened, and he glanced at Davis, who was already signaling the officers to prepare for a potential breach. Patterson's adrenaline surged, and he gripped his weapon, ready to act. The silence stretched on as everyone held their breath, waiting for the next move. Another gunshot rang out, echoing through the tense air, sending shivers down the spines of everyone outside. Admiral Carter stayed calm, though his jaw tightened. He took the radio back to his lips, his voice firm and measured. "I heard the gunshot," he said, addressing the suspects inside. "If you harm anyone, there's no going back. No one's getting hurt if you work with me. Tell me everyone's safe." There was silence, and then the voice returned, sharper now. "We're in control here. I told you what we need. Get us a car or you'll see what happens." Carter took a steady breath. He knew he had to keep them talking, keep them focused on him instead of harming anyone. "You're upset, I understand that. But hurting people will make this worse. Let's keep calm and make this work for you." Another pause, and then the voice, now wavering, came back. We're serious. Get us a car," or the line cut off. Patterson exchanged a look with Sergeant Davis. She was already on her radio, calling in updates to SWAT and checking on their arrival status. They were close, but still a few minutes out. Meanwhile, Carter remained composed, holding the radio, waiting to re-establish contact. The Admiral's voice softened slightly, though he remained authoritative. "Listen," he began again. "I've been in a lot of situations like this. I know it's scary, but hurting innocent people isn't the way to solve anything. Why don't you come out and we'll figure this out together?" Inside, the robbers were beginning to break. The Admiral's steady, reassuring tone had them questioning their plan. The initial rush of adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by panic and regret. But just as it seemed like they might be persuaded, one of the suspects, a younger man named Kyle, felt cornered. He had a weapon, but this wasn't the plan. He hadn't expected to feel so out of control. His hands were shaking. "Shut up, all of you," he shouted to the hostages who huddled together in fear. One of the older hostages tried to calm him, saying, "Please, son, don't make this worse for yourself. Listen to the man outside. You can still make it out of this." Kyle glanced at his partner, a more hardened man named Derek, who gave him a hard look. "We aren't giving up," Derek hissed. "They give us what we want, or we go down swinging." Outside, Patterson felt his nerves unraveling. This could all go wrong in a matter of seconds. He glanced over at Admiral Carter, who met his gaze with a reassuring nod as if sensing Patterson's anxiety. But before he could gather his thoughts, Carter spoke into the radio once more. "We're bringing you food and water. I need you to put your weapons down when we hand them over," Carter instructed. "Once we get everyone's needs met, we'll get that car and see about getting you out safely." There was a hesitant reply, a crackling of static before one of the suspects answered, "Fine, but hurry up." Davis nodded to Patterson and gestured to the team to prepare the supplies. As they readied the delivery, Patterson's mind raced. He couldn't believe the Admiral's patience, his skill in managing the situation. Watching him, Patterson felt a pang of regret. His previous encounter with Carter now felt even more glaring. He judged him unfairly, jumped to conclusions without a second thought. And yet here Carter was, putting his life on the line to help. Not out of obligation, but out of a sense of duty that Patterson suddenly felt he might never understand. A few minutes later, Patterson and another officer approached the bank entrance with food and water. Following Carter's instructions, they kept their hands visible and made no sudden moves. Patterson could see two shadows through the glass doors, one holding a weapon. He swallowed, feeling the intensity of the situation weigh down on him. Kyle, the younger of the two suspects, opened the door just a crack, his face tense. Patterson held his breath, feeling the cold metal of the food containers in his hands. He tried to keep his face calm, but the fear in Kyle's eyes was unmistakable. As Patterson handed over the supplies, he spoke softly. "It doesn't have to end this way. You can put down the weapon and come out. No one needs to get hurt." Kyle's hand shook slightly, his grip on the gun wavering. But just as it seemed like he might relent, Derek, the older, more hardened suspect, grabbed the food and yanked Kyle back inside, slamming the door shut. Outside, Carter saw the entire exchange and tightened his jaw. He could tell that Derek was the driving force, the one keeping things dangerous. He raised the radio to his lips again. "Let's keep talking," he called into the building. "Tell me about the people with you. I know they're scared, and so are you. Tell me what you need to feel safe." Back inside, Kyle turned to Derek, a pleading look on his face. "Maybe we should just give up, man. This is too much. That guy outside, he's different. He's trying to help." But Derek shook his head, a steady resolve in his eyes. "No, we're not giving in," he snapped. "We get the car and we get out of here. They're not going to trick us." Suddenly, there was movement outside. The SWAT team had arrived, slipping into position without drawing attention. Carter noticed them, giving a subtle nod to Patterson and Davis. They were ready for a breach if it became necessary, but he wanted to avoid that at all costs. If he could convince Kyle to let the hostages go, maybe the situation could still end peacefully. Carter returned to the radio, his voice calm and steady. "Kyle," he said, using the younger suspect's name, which he overheard during the exchange. "I know you don't want to hurt anyone. You're scared, and I understand that. We're here to help, but you need to work with me." Inside, Kyle looked startled that Carter had called him by name. He took a deep breath, feeling his own fear and regret swell inside him. This wasn't the plan. He hadn't wanted any of this. He'd just made a bad decision, and now he was caught in it, unable to see a way out. Derek saw Kyle wavering and shook his head, moving toward the hostages with a menacing look. "I swear," he muttered to the crowd of terrified faces, "one wrong move and—" But before he could finish his threat, Kyle grabbed his arm, his voice desperate. "Stop, Derek. Enough. I can't do this anymore." Outside, Carter and the other officers listened, tense and hopeful. They could hear the struggle, the cracking of voices through the radio. It was the chance they needed. "SWAT, hold position," Carter whispered into his radio, eyes fixed on the bank. "Let's give him a chance." Inside, Kyle's voice broke as he faced Derek. "I don't want anyone hurt. This was supposed to be quick. No one getting hurt. Just let's end this, Derek, please." For a brief moment, Derek's face softened, caught off guard by Kyle's desperation. But then his expression hardened. He took a step back, raising his weapon toward the hostages. "I'm not going down alone," he growled. Just as he raised his gun, the SWAT team outside got the signal. The breach was imminent, every officer on high alert. Patterson's heart pounded as he watched the door, knowing that any second now, they would have to move. In a flash, the SWAT team burst into action, the door of the bank shattering as they deployed flashbangs and stormed in. The loud bangs and sudden light disoriented Derek, who staggered back, dropping his weapon as he covered his ears. Kyle, already rattled, fell to the floor, hands over his head, surrendering almost instantly. Patterson and Davis moved in with the other officers, quickly securing the suspects and guiding the shaken hostages to safety. Patterson helped an elderly woman to her feet, noticing her tears of relief as she held his arm. "Thank you, officer," she whispered, clutching his hand as they made their way out of the building. Amid the chaos, Admiral Carter stayed just outside, watching as each hostage emerged. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing only after the last person exited safely. Patterson approached him, his face a mixture of awe and humility. "Thank you, sir," he said, struggling to find the right words. I don't know if we could have done this without you." Carter looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a slight nod. "You handled yourself well, Officer Patterson. You were able to adapt, even in difficult circumstances." Patterson swallowed, feeling both grateful and unsettled. This wasn't just about the hostage situation. He knew that Carter was giving him a chance to reflect on everything that had happened that day. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of more backup, and the officer's attention shifted to securing the area. After the suspects were fully detained, Davis gathered the officers for a debriefing. Patterson lingered by the edge of the group, his mind still buzzing. His gaze kept drifting back to Admiral Carter, who stood nearby, quietly observing the aftermath of the operation. The tension from earlier that day had faded, but a sense of unfinished business lingered between them. When the debriefing ended, Patterson gathered his courage and approached Carter once more. "Admiral," he began, clearing his throat, I made a mistake with you earlier. I misjudged you, and I let my own biases affect how I acted. I'm sorry. I realize now just how wrong I was." Carter looked at him steadily, then nodded. "Acknowledging your mistake is a good first step," he replied, "but it's only the beginning, Patterson. Changing how you act, how you see people, that's the hard part." Patterson nodded, his face filled with earnest regret. "I understand, sir. I'll work on it. This has been a wake-up call for me." Carter's face softened slightly, and he extended a hand. "I hope you do, officer. This country needs people who will truly serve and protect all of its citizens." Patterson shook his hand, feeling both humbled and grateful. As they parted ways, he knew that this day would stay with him forever, not just for what had happened inside the bank, but for what he had learned about himself and the kind of officer he wanted to become. But just as Patterson thought the day was over, a new development emerged. Derek, the more dangerous of the two suspects, had managed to slip out of his cuffs during transport. There was a scuffle, and an officer's shout rang out from nearby. Patterson spun around, his heart racing as he saw Derek sprinting toward the crowd, a weapon clutched in his hand, his eyes wild with desperation. And in that instant, Patterson realized that the day's challenges were far from over. Derek, seizing his moment, bolted through the chaos, his hands free and his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and rage. He held a small handgun he must have hidden on himself, its metallic gleam catching the afternoon light as he ran toward a cluster of bystanders, his movements frantic and desperate. "Derek's loose," an officer shouted, alerting the others as panic rippled through the crowd. Civilians began to scatter, some ducking behind parked cars, others sprinting down the sidewalk, shrieks filling the air. Patterson's heart leaped into his throat as he caught sight of Derek heading directly toward a young family that had been watching from across the street, their eyes wide with terror as the armed man came closer. Without hesitating, Patterson pulled his weapon and started moving, shouting, "Stop! Drop the weapon, Derek." He kept his tone forceful but controlled, hoping his voice would break through Derek's haze of fear. But Derek didn't stop. Instead, he whirled around, aiming the gun wildly as he backed toward the family, using them as a shield. Patterson's mind raced as he assessed the situation. Derek was too close to the family. Any sudden move could put them in harm's way. Admiral Carter, who had been observing from nearby, took a step forward, his calm presence steadying the scene even as tension mounted. He caught Patterson's eye, giving him a brief nod, silently conveying his trust and support. Patterson took a deep breath, steadying his aim as he slowly advanced, his eyes locked on Derek. "It's over, Derek," he called out, his voice low and firm. "You don't have to hurt anyone else. Put the gun down and let these people go. We'll get you the help you need." For a split second, Derek hesitated. His hand shook, his grip on the weapon loosening as his eyes darted between Patterson and the family beside him. But then a look of defiance flashed across his face, and he raised the gun, aiming directly at Patterson. "Stay back," Derek shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not going back to prison." Patterson's heart hammered, but he didn't flinch. "Derek, you're only making this worse for yourself. No one has to get hurt." He kept his eyes on Derek's, willing him to see reason, to let go of the fear that was driving him. But Derek's gaze was wild, desperate, and Patterson could see he was beyond reasoning. In one quick, decisive move, Patterson readied himself, his finger poised on the trigger, knowing that time was running out. Then, in a flash, Admiral Carter stepped forward, positioning himself between Patterson and Derek, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Derek," he said, his voice calm and commanding, "listen to me. I see men in worse situations than this. I know it feels like there's no way out, but there is. It doesn't have to end this way. You have a choice right now." Derek's eyes flickered, his resolve wavering as he stared at Carter. For a moment, his grip loosened, the gun dropping slightly. "Just put it down," Carter continued, his tone steady, his presence exuding a quiet strength. "Trust me. No one here wants to see you hurt. You can still make things right." The air was thick with tension as Derek stood frozen, his mind battling with the fear and anger that had driven him this far. And then finally his shoulders sagged, his hand loosening as the gun slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. In an instant, Patterson and the other officers surged forward, securing Derek and leading him away. The crowd began to relax, the danger having passed, and a wave of relief swept through the bystanders. Patterson felt a surge of gratitude as he looked over at Carter, who met his gaze with a nod of approval. Patterson knew that without the Admiral's calm presence, the situation could have ended very differently. He was starting to realize that there was a strength in patience and understanding that went beyond force, a lesson Carter had shown him time and again throughout that day. As Derek was led away, Patterson approached Carter, his expression earnest. "Thank you, Admiral. I couldn't have done that without you." Carter smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes it's about giving people a way out, Patterson. You did well today." Patterson nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to protect and serve, not just by enforcing the law, but by finding a way to connect, even in the hardest of situations. But as the scene began to clear, Patterson's radio crackled to life with a call he didn't expect. Another unit had reported an incident, a break-in at the precinct with key files missing. The team's work, it seemed, was far from over. The radio call hung in the air, casting a sudden tension over the aftermath of the crisis. Patterson exchanged a glance with Admiral Carter, who, despite the long day, looked alert and focused. "Files missing?" Patterson asked, already piecing things together. He suspected Derek's arrest might have triggered the break-in, an attempt by accomplices to protect whatever secrets he held. Carter nodded, immediately understanding the implications. Someone wanted to cover their tracks. Whatever Derek was involved in goes deeper than this bank robbery. Patterson's expression hardened. "I'll head back to the precinct and see what's been taken," he said, his sense of duty renewed. Today had given him a fresh perspective, and he wanted to prove he could be the kind of officer who handled tough situations with integrity. Back at the precinct, Patterson and Carter met with a team of officers who were securing the area. The files missing included records connected to a large-scale investigation into organized crime networks in the area. Derek had been a small player, but it was clear he was tied to something bigger. As the investigation unfolded, Patterson stayed vigilant, working closely with his colleagues and drawing on the guidance he received from Carter that day. The missing files were eventually recovered, and the culprits were arrested, revealing a network of crime that was dismantled through careful police work and teamwork. Throughout it all, Patterson's respect for Admiral Carter only grew. The Admiral's calm approach to every crisis taught him that true strength lay in patience, empathy, and resilience. Months later, as Patterson looked back on the incident, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The experience had changed him, reshaping how he saw his role as a police officer. He carried Carter's lessons forward, striving to serve all citizens fairly and worked to ensure others on the force understood the importance of breaking down biases and leading with respect. Patterson had become a better officer, and with each day he worked to earn the trust of his community. And as he rose through the ranks, he knew one thing for sure: everything he learned from Admiral Carter would be the foundation of the legacy he aimed to leave behind.